limited to nitric acid. Only because nitric acid was already known to be a shrinking agent for yarns. I said, well, adipic acid is a known polyester ingredient. And all the other ingredients? I did then what he had carefully taught me to do when I was losing an argument. I quickly shifted to another point. In Ex parte Tab, the applicant merely disclosed raisins and raisin oil, but that was enough to support claims to dried fruit and edible oil. But in that case the Board of Appeals said they allowed such terminology only because the equivalency of the substances could be foreseen by those skilled in the art, foreseen with certainty, too. Can you say that about your substances? I hesitated before I answered, and that was all he needed to take over. A large number of ingredients was recited in re Ellis, and since there was no evidence to show that they all would not work, the applicant was allowed broad claims. But you'd have trouble making your guessed at ingredients stick. In the case of Corona Cord Tire Company versus Dovin, the court said the patentee was entitled to his broader claims because he proved he had tested a reasonable number of the members of a chemical class. Have you? I started to answer, but Mr. Spardleton was in full swing now, and he said to me, "No, sir, you haven't. You are not ready to put in broad claims on a half-baked invention." It was the half-baked that did it. Controlling my temper, I rose to my feet and said in a purposeful and quiet voice, "I think I see clearly how this case should be handled in this situation. I shall prepare it in that manner and file it and prosecute it and obtain a strong patent on a pathfinder invention. I'll keep you posted." I turned and walked out. Just as I passed through the door, I thought I heard him say softly, "Attaboy, Carl." But I must have been mistaken. Mr. Spardleton never calls me Carl. I got right at it the very next morning. I opened the office myself and began studying my notes to see how broad a claim I could write for the tear-proof paper case. I listed all the ingredients in one column and then filled up the adjacent columns with all the possible substitutes I could think of. I didn't even know it when Susan arrived at the office, stood in my doorway for a moment, and then tiptoed away. Later on, Mr. Spardleton looked in on me, and I wasn't aware of that either. It was 10 o'clock before I finally came up for air, and then I dashed out to the Marchare laboratory for another talk with Callahan. I explained how I was going to handle the case to make sure we got a good, broad patent application into the patent office. "Can you do that?" he asked. "Oh, yes. We can put in all the things we think will work, but if we are wrong we are in some degree of trouble. But I feel that with both of us working on this we ought to be able to turn out a good sound job. I'll keep sending you drafts out in San Francisco until we finally get one we think good enough to file. But we can't waste time. This is a hot one, and we want to get it in as soon as possible." He shrugged his shoulders, and we sat down to work on my lists. Neither one of us realized it when lunchtime came and went, but that's the way it is with world-beater inventions. They sweep you along. Early that afternoon I dictated my first draft to Susan. Callahan and I went over the draft, and then he left for San Francisco. The next time around we had to use airmail. With each new draft we added more to the basic information we had, rounding out the invention in ever greater detail. I added example after example, being careful to state them in the present tense. I did not want to give the impression that the examples had actually been run. In a month's time I checked with John Bostick. Bostick had been able to duplicate Callahan's work, and we had 3 more flimsy diaphanous sheets that could not be torn by human hands. That was all I needed. Now I knew that anyone could duplicate the tear-proof paper, and I had at least one good substantial working example for my patent application. The knowledge gave me greater confidence in the alternate materials and procedures that Callahan and I had dreamed up. I prepared a final draft containing 23 pages of detailed specification and 11 examples, and topped it all off with 46 claims. It was a magnificent application, considering what I had to start with. I handed it to Mr. Spardleton and sat down to hear what he had to say about it. I watched him out of the corner of my eye as he read it, and I had the pleasure of seeing his cigar slowly swing outward until the glowing end was almost beneath one of his ears. This, I knew, was his amazed position, and it was rare indeed that I or anyone else ever saw it. Mr. Spardleton was a man who does not amaze easily. He finished and looked up at me and said, I assume this is the same invention you told me about last month?" When I nodded, he continued, "And I further assume that you have no experimental data in addition to that you described last month?" Again I nodded, and he said, "All of this is paperwork with the exception of example 1?" I nodded again, and he put the draft down in front of him and stared at it. I began to grow uncomfortable in the silence. Then he said, so softly that I could hardly hear him, "I remember, many, many years ago, answering the phone, Cliff Norbright, great chemist, telling me he had smelled phenol when he heated ethylene chlorhydrin in the presence of holmium-treated silica gel in a test tube. I wrote the greatest patent application of the age based on that evidence, just like this one." He laid a hand on it and shook his head and smiled. "There is no crude guesswork in this product," I said. "The work has been duplicated, and I've seen many specimens of this paper. I tell you, sir, there never has been anything like it. Why, even Callahan—" "Yes? Tell me about Dr. Callahan. He is usually a pretty conservative fellow. How does he feel about this completely untried product?" I sat up straighter. "This is not an untried product, Mr. Spardleton. It has been made and duplicated. It has all the properties that the application says it has, and Dr. Callahan has just as much faith in it as I have." Mr. Spardleton looked at me and smiled, and slowly handed over the draft. "Mr. Saddle, I wish you all the best in your prosecution of this case. Please call on me if there is anything I can do to help. In any way, don't hesitate to call on me." I stood up and took the draft and turned to go, but Mr. Spardleton thrust his hand out. I shook it and said, "Is anything wrong with it?" "Not that I am able to see, Mr. Saddle. It is a most remarkable job, and bespeaks of ingenuity, resourcefulness, and skill. You have come a long way to be able to write such an application." I didn't know what to say, so I smiled and bobbed my head and walked out, still looking at him and smiling, which made it necessary for me to walk sideways, and thus made me look, I suppose, somewhat like a crab. Susan put the case in final form. We sent the papers to California for Callahan's signature. Then we filed the case, and things got back to normal with me. It was a great relief not to have the strain on me night and day. That's the trouble with an important case. You live with it too much. It was 7 months before I got the first office action in the case. I read the first few paragraphs and they were quite normal. They rejected the case in the usual manner by citing prior patents that had nothing to do with my application. This kind of thing was just part of the game of prosecution in which the patent examiner makes rejections because that is what he's supposed to do, no matter what the invention. They don't have to make much sense. But then came a paragraph that went way beyond good sense and proper rejection technique. It said, "The specification is objected to as containing large portions that are merely laudatory. See Ex parte Grieg 181 OG 266 and Ex parte Wellington 113 OG 2218. These portions are superfluous and should be deleted. Ex parte Ball 1902 CD 1326. The specification is unnecessarily prolix throughout and contains an unduly large number of embodiments. Ex parte Blakeman 98 OG 791. Shortening is required." I didn't wait. I grabbed the file of the case and almost ran over to the patent office to straighten out the examiner on a few things. As usual, Herbert Krome was the examiner, so I charged up to his desk and immediately began explaining to him the importance of the tear-proof paper case. He seemed to pay no attention to me, but I knew him. He was listening. When I finally paused to let him say something, he looked at me quizzically and said, "Mr. Saddle, aren't you aware of the notice of October 11th, 1955? I looked at him blankly and said, "What's that?" "It says that interviews with examiners are not to be held on Fridays except in exceptional circumstances." I gulped and said, "Is today Friday?" He pushed his desk calendar toward me. It was Friday all right, and the 13th at that. I was too embarrassed to speak, and I got up and began to walk out. Mr. Krome called after me, "This must be an important case, Mr. Saddle. I'll expect to see you the first thing Monday." I nodded and left. By Monday my embarrassment had not diminished. I had really done an unheard of thing in patent prosecution. In patent prosecution the patent attorney